Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez, and it has been a solemn day here in Washington as the president, lawmakers, and world leaders all pay tribute to the late Senator Lindsey Graham. His death leaving a void for policymakers at home and abroad as the U.S. charts a path forward in two major global conflicts. We're looking at live pictures of Graham's funeral service at the National Cathedral here in Washington. Right now, they're nearing the conclusion of the ceremony, and in just a few moments, we expect to see Senator Graham's casket carried out of the church, with his family looking on. At the service this afternoon, President Trump paying tribute to the late senator. Here's some of what he said.
But even though Lindsey's life was cut short while he was still so full of vim and vigor, there can be no doubt that he lived absolutely to the fullest. He died doing the work he was born to do. Above all, Lindsey Graham believed in a strong America. He wanted a strong America. He had unwavering faith in the righteousness of American power and prayer. And he was extremely hawkish. I will tell you, he never saw a war that he didn't like. Only his true friends would understand that, but he wanted it for the good of our country. He felt in his bones that our destiny is to win, and that his job was to do everything he could to ensure our enemies would lose.
This all follows a somber ceremony on Capitol Hill honoring Senator Graham's more than 3 decades of service in Congress. Military pallbearers, as you see there, carrying the flag-draped casket up the steps of the Capitol and into the rotunda, where current and former lawmakers from both sides of the aisle, visibly emotional, mourned his death. All of this coming at a pivotal time amid the ongoing wars in Ukraine and Iran, both of which the late Senator Graham was deeply involved with and was a key voice in shaping the administration's policies. Both Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are in Washington to attend Senator Graham's funeral. And this morning they met separately with President Trump at the White House as questions swirl about how the administration plans to move forward on both wars. The meeting today between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu was their first face-to-face discussion since the U.S. and Israel launched joint strikes on Iran back in February. Today, the war is entering its 6th month, despite the president initially saying it would last 4 to 6 weeks. Tensions between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have been escalating, with the president growing increasingly frustrated with Netanyahu's approach to the war, at one point calling it, quote, crazy. Here's President Trump earlier today brushing aside reports that Netanyahu was headed to the White House with intelligence on Iran's nuclear site, Pickaxe Mountain.
There are reports now that Netanyahu is going to talk to you about ongoing excavation at Pickaxe Mountain, construction vehicles entering and exiting tunnels, paving new access roads. Satellite imagery and intel indicates that Iran is actively constructing and fortifying Pickaxe Mountain. How will we respond?
Well, I don't need Bibi to tell me that. Bibi's telling me that because he wants me to stay involved. I know exactly what's going on at Pickaxe. It's not a big problem. We took out their nuclear sites, and we'll have to take out Pickaxe if we don't make a deal. If we don't make a deal, we'll take it out very easily.
And joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, and with me here on set are NBC News international correspondent Matt Bradley and NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube. Monica, I want to start with you, though. Let's start with the ceremonies today honoring Senator Graham. What do you make of the president's remarks, and what does this all mean for the president's foreign policy moving forward?
Yeah, clearly the late senator was a very influential voice on foreign policy for this president and for this administration. It wasn't just President Trump who spoke about that, but many others have really recalled how relentless Lindsey Graham was in reaching out and calling senior aides and really making his viewpoint pretty clear. But President Trump went all the way back to 2016 to sort of trace the evolution of their relationship and the fact that obviously he was a rival when they first met, when they were both running for the GOP nomination back then. And in his typical fashion, the president certainly tried to inject his own humor into this and spoke about some funnier stories and anecdotes that the two had certainly been a part of and shared, recalling in particular that moment where he gave out Lindsey Graham's cell phone. And then, of course, he said that it was Lindsey who got the last laugh, according to the president, because he's the one who called him pretty much nonstop for the last decade. So really tracing his own legacy, his own influence, and acknowledging that very close personal relationship that the two had.
And Monica, a lot to follow here in Washington today. What do we know about the president's meeting with Netanyahu earlier today and his thinking right now, the president's thinking when it comes to Iran?
Yeah, I mean, certainly this is a meeting that was added because the prime minister was going to be here for the late senator's funeral. But it does come at a time when there is plenty to discuss from the Israeli perspective and side of things. And they have released a readout of this. The White House has not given their full details on how the meeting went, apart from calling it productive and positive. But according to Prime Minister Netanyahu, they discussed the issue with Lebanon, which, of course, has been a big focus for the Trump administration in recent weeks, and seeing how that agreement can continue to improve in the coming days and weeks, which has been kind of happening on a parallel track. But specifically with Iran, Israel has been very clear about its position, and today does mark 5 months since the U.S. and Israel started those joint strikes in Iran. And certainly Prime Minister Netanyahu has been clear about his position that he would like to see that continue. He would like to see a military escalation. President Trump, though, as you played in the introduction, Gabe, has been clear that he'll be making those decisions on his own, regardless of input potentially from the Israeli prime minister.
Monica, stay with us. I want to turn now to Courtney Kube. Courtney, the president said today that the U.S. could take out Pickaxe Mountain, quote, very easily. What's the reality there?
Yeah, and he's been threatening to go after Pickaxe now for several days. The reality is it depends on exactly what he means by take it out, right? So the U.S. could absolutely conduct airstrikes there. They've got what they need to do it. We've seen that. We saw them with these deep penetrating bombs last year. And in fact, the U.S. has even flown bombers in recent weeks into Iran. So it's totally possible that they could do it. But the question is, can they really actually get after what they would need to in Pickaxe to make a real difference to the nuclear program? There has been some satellite imagery from think tanks and nonpartisan groups that have shown increased activity or continuing activity around Pickaxe even after Midnight Hammer last year. And the concern is that there could be some centrifuges in there that could provide Iran with the ability to enrich uranium and to potentially further their nuclear program. But it's buried so deeply underground, it's not really clear if U.S. bombs could even reach it. And then again, it gets back to this overall strategic goal of this war of eliminating the nuclear program. If in fact they were to strike Pickaxe but not actually send ground troops in, would that actually eliminate their ability to have a nuclear weapon long term?
And Matt, I want to turn to you. By the way, good to have you here on set. You're based in Israel, but you're here in D.C. today. We mentioned it in the introduction that the relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu is becoming more and more strained as this war goes on. What are you hearing about that relationship? And is it, in fact, getting more strained the longer this war drags on?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can see it with some of the movements at the White House, some of the conversation that we saw even today. This was kind of a make or break moment for Prime Minister Netanyahu. And the more that this war kind of drags on, that's one issue. But the real issue here is the impending elections coming up for Benjamin Netanyahu, and in a way, to a lesser extent, for Trump with the midterm elections. Both men are facing serious contests that are going to be judging their behavior in this region, in the Middle East, in Iran. And so both of them are feeling what is essentially bubbling up domestic pressure underneath them. Benjamin Netanyahu has long been trying to paint himself, stylize himself as the Trump whisperer, as the Washington whisperer. And now he has a president who has publicly excoriated him.
Yeah, getting harder to do that for a domestic audience, or at least project that image to a domestic audience. Courtney, regardless of what Prime Minister Netanyahu told President Trump behind closed doors in the Oval Office today, do you get the sense that the administration really wants to escalate this war?
I think there are completely competing narratives in the administration. That's the problem. The reason that there hasn't been a clear path forward here, despite how many meetings have they had where they've tried to discuss the policy and the strategy, and there isn't one that has emerged here. And I think that's because there are two different sides. There are those who want to try to figure out some way to make diplomacy work. And then there are the others who are saying, look, a couple more weeks of strikes, they can take out the rest of their production capabilities. They can go after the remaining missiles, the launchers, potentially going after the nuclear sites. And then maybe they could actually say they have really degraded Iran's military capabilities, their conventional capabilities, to the point where it would be really difficult for them to rebuild a nuclear program. But at this point, it doesn't seem like there is any consensus within the higher levels of the Trump administration to provide him with some sort of a decision that he can then give to the military. That is why we saw these 13 days of consecutive strikes that were occurring that were all in one area. It never really expanded out. We didn't see any escalation. We didn't see them move into new locations. It was very tailored to the coastal area.
And Matt, as we look at some live pictures of this, funeral ceremony ending at the National Cathedral, we know that Senator Graham had a close relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Do officials in Israel feel that they've lost this close ally by losing Senator Graham, and does it leave a hole in the Trump administration in their view?
Yeah, absolutely right, Gabe. I mean, they definitely feel the loss of Senator Graham, who was a singular advocate for Israel and for this war in Iran, as we saw from that documentary footage that came out over the past couple of days. But really, it's more than that. Senator Graham was also, his passing represents kind of a changing of the guard. He was part of a dwindling breed of Republicans who saw Israel not just as an American ally or a close American ally, but as part and parcel with American interests. They saw Israel as an extension of America's ideology, of its security interests, and of its sensibilities in the region. So really, when they see someone like Graham passing away, it doesn't just mean they're losing one voice. It means there's very few voices left who are willing to take that stand.
And Courtney, President Trump has downplayed concerns about the depleted U.S. weapons stockpile. Yesterday, he said that, he blamed the Biden administration for giving weapons to Ukraine. Are those two things related?
Yes, that's been their talking point. Secretary Hegseth has said that on Capitol Hill as well, that the Biden administration depleted the munitions. That's actually, yes, the Biden administration did provide munitions, but one of the biggest ones that they provided were 155 rounds. That's not what the U.S. is using right now when it comes to Iran. And the reality is the U.S. has been depleting the stockpiles of these very critical, longer-range defensive munitions, so the Patriots and the THAADs, beginning last June of 2025, when the U.S. was defending Israel during the 12-day war and defending against attacks from Iran, also defending against attacks from the Houthis. So there has been this consistent op tempo that really then sped up, of course, in February. Right. So the stockpiles are low. President Trump is telling the truth when he says, we have tons of bombs, we have the ability to carry out this. And that is because they do have a lot of those offensive munitions. It's the long-range precision ones that are the concern.
And I did think it was interesting yesterday, he did acknowledge that, he'd like to have more.
Yeah.
But Courtney Kube, Matt Bradley, thank you so much for being here. I want to turn very quickly to Monica Alba back at the White House. Monica, President Trump, as we mentioned, also met with Ukraine's President Zelenskyy today. What more do we know about that meeting? And just how much of a void will Senator Graham's passing leave in terms of support for Ukraine? We just discussed Israel, but what about Ukraine?
And of course, it was Ukraine that Senator Graham was returning from when he did fall ill and eventually passed away. He had just come back from meeting with President Zelenskyy, and he is the one who is sharing some details about this meeting. Again, we're learning more from the other countries as opposed to the White House on exactly what was discussed. But Ukrainian officials essentially said that this is a moment in which they feel that diplomatic pursuits, that peace talks can be, quote, reinvigorated potentially with some moves by the Trump administration. We'll see what that actually amounts to. But remember something that we covered, Gabe, back when we were in Turkey, which is this idea that the U.S. is going to grant the license to Ukraine to create their own Patriot missile interceptors. Now, that will take a long time, so it's unclear whether anything would be ready in time for the battlefield needs of the moment. But that was something that President Zelenskyy was touting that they discussed today in the Oval Office as well. Gabe.
Monica Alba, live for us at the White House. Monica, thank you. And joining me now here on set is Elise Labott, host of the Cosmopolitics podcast. Elise, I want to get to Ukraine in just a moment, but I do want to start with Iran. As we mentioned, President Trump initially said that this would be a 4 to 6 week excursion. We're now about to enter the 6th month, or are entering the 6th month of this war. What's your read on where things stand right now?
I think both sides want to escalate, don't want to escalate. They want to kind of try and find a way back to the table. But at the same time, neither one is really willing to give up on those core concessions. So, and when you talk about Prime Minister Netanyahu and his relationship to President Trump, I think it's Prime Minister Netanyahu has been the same all along. It's President Trump that kind of vacillates, and it's like pick a pedal. I love Bibi when I want to escalate, and I don't when I want to pull back. So the relationship is, pretty steady if President Trump would pick a side. He, I think, doesn't really know what he wants to do. He's facing these political pressures of the midterm. Prime Minister Netanyahu, Gabe, he has his own personal interests, as we've been talking about, his political interest in the election, and then he has Israel's interests. So that's just really finite. But President Trump, you could talk about America first, but he's got the world economy, he's got other allies in the Gulf, and he has a lot more equities. So he's really not sure whether he wants to go for it with Prime Minister Netanyahu or climb back. And
as we're looking at these live pictures of guests leaving the memorial service at the National Cathedral, Prime Minister Netanyahu, by the way, among those guests. You were talking about, yes, the relationship between the two leaders, how it's been President Trump that has kind of waffled here. What do you think what would Prime Minister Netanyahu consider a success coming here to Washington today, a meeting that he's asked for before, and, perhaps surprisingly some, their first face-to-face discussion? What would he consider a victory coming out of this meeting today with the president?
Agreement to keep escalating. I think that's really what President Trump has been vacillating on, and that's what Prime Minister Netanyahu, he's not ready for this war to end. He can't have it end, because once it ends, it's pretty clear from the Israeli public and that his political career, if not his, freedom, would be over. If he loses the election, then he can be convicted and put in jail. And so, again, he's got those very narrow interests. President Trump has a much broader set of interests.
Incredibly high stakes for Prime Minister Netanyahu, but also for another world leader that came here to Washington today. Ukrainian President Zelenskyy, he called it a good meeting that he had with President Trump earlier today. And we're looking actually right now at live pictures of President Zelenskyy meeting or leaving the memorial service right there. Both world leaders, as I said, very high-stakes day for them. Would you say President Trump is warming to Zelenskyy? Has their relationship, has it turned a corner? I remember being at the White House early on in the administration and, seeing that Oval Office meeting and how shocking it was. Well, my goodness, what a year and a half it has been.
I was going to say the same thing. What a difference a year and change makes. At the time, President Trump was saying to Zelenskyy, you don't have the cards. Today, President Zelenskyy is coming with the cards. Not only has Ukraine, made advances on the battlefield, but I think what really interests Trump even more is not just the Ukrainians' resilience, but the innovation that the Ukrainians have showed in drone technology that they're not just using on the battlefield in Russia, but they're also helping the Gulf. You saw Zelenskyy travel out to the Gulf to meet with countries about defending Iran. And I think it's really, to bring it back to the funeral on Lindsey Graham, that day that you were in the Oval Office with that horrible meeting, the next day, Lindsey Graham was like, all right, we got to get this relationship back on track. And I think what he did was help the leaders, calm it down. I think he helped President Trump understand Zelenskyy and the Ukrainians a little better. And I think he helped Zelenskyy translate Trump. And I think Zelenskyy understands Trump a little better. And now everyone's looking at Zelenskyy a little bit different. Everybody, when you were in Turkey with Courtney, they were talking about Ukraine and NATO. Now NATO is studying Ukraine as, how to innovate and develop your own strategic autonomy.
The drone technology has been very impressive. And President Trump has said so himself.
He likes a winner.
That's right. Exactly right. Zelenskyy today, he said that the president also spoke about the Patriot interceptor production and the licenses. During NATO, President Trump had discussed this. But what's the reality here? How long could it take for, these Patriot interceptors to be produced in Ukraine? It couldn't take a significant amount of time.
It could take a few years, but look at what the Ukrainians have done with their own drone technology just in the last few years. I mean, we continue to underestimate the Ukrainians. So there's a difference between the actual production line time and the perception. that the Ukrainians are on the front foot. They're on the ones in advance. The Russians are on the back foot. There's also this whole issue that the Russians have maybe been supplying the Iranians with intelligence to go after U.S. bases. So President Trump has kind of been loath to turn against Putin. But when you see a winner like President Zelenskyy, and you see that the U.S. could actually help turn the tide, and you see, he's supposed to ask President Putin if he provided the intelligence, I think he knows what the truth is. So it'll be interesting to see, obviously about the Patriots, but just the perception in President Trump's mind about whether to back Ukraine.
Elise Labott, thank you so much for your expertise. We really appreciate it.
You bet.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.